Hello, this is Ms. DB. In this assignment, we are going to solve quadratic equations with the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula will work to solve any quadratic function, any quadratic equation. It's not the easiest thing to do because you have to keep track of a lot of variables and the plus minus, and there's a square root to simplify. But it will work on solving any quadratic equation, even those that have non-real roots, imaginary numbers as roots, and you'll work more with those in another class, not on this assignment. So on this one, when you do b squared minus 4ac, the part underneath the square root sign, you will always get a positive answer. If you simplify these and get a negative answer for this worksheet, you've made a mistake, because I've limited this worksheet to only getting real zeros. But you probably will have a square root, and it probably won't be a perfect square for many of these. And we're only going to do a few of these just to practice. You'll practice this more in Algebra 2. And then we're also going to then, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. We're also going to then look at a summary of all the different methods of solving quadratic equations on this worksheet. And then to finish this off, you'll pick 4 of the following problems to solve with any of the methods. So you don't have to use the quadratic equation on these ones. You can use any method that works. So we've looked at solving by factoring, we've looked at solving by graphing, and we've looked at solving by taking the square root. So here's a summary of those and kind of what they would look like. And completing the square, this is one we'll do in another class as well. We won't do that in Algebra 1. And here is the quadratic formula. This is something that eventually you'll memorize, but for this class you can just keep looking back to what it is. So remember that the standard form of a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c. And we've worked with that before, and we have found what a, what b, and what c are. And you're going to have to do that again, make sure it's in standard form. And then you take the values of a, b, and c, and you put them into this equation. So whatever b was, you would need a negative, or the opposite of that, plus the square root, or plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and then this whole thing is divided by 2 times a. So here's an example with, let's see, in this one, it's x squared plus 10x plus 2, so a would be 1, b would be a positive 10, and c would be a positive 2. So the first thing that they did is they replaced a, b, and c in the quadratic equation with those values. So it's negative b, or in other words, the opposite of b, so that's negative 10, plus or minus the square root of 10 squared, because b squared would be 10 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. And then from here on, it's just simplifying. It just takes a little while to simplify all this, and you have to be careful to use the order of operations. You've got to multiply before you subtract. Take the square, or take the perfect square, or the power of 2 before you multiply, and so on. And when you get done, this is really 2 answers. You have negative 5 plus the square root of 23 and negative 5 minus the square root of 23. So there will be 2 answers like we've looked at most times when you have a quadratic. It will cross the x-axis at 2 points, and that's what we're finding. All right, so let's look at an example. Number 1 has been set up for you. I've already set it up equal to 0. So there we go. I've already identified a, b, and c, and I've already put those values into the quadratic formula. Now this is, I used Microsoft Word, and this is an equation tool that I used to set this up. If you can't see this because you're using something besides Microsoft Word, like OpenOffice, then you'll want to open the PDF version of this worksheet instead of instead of my Word version that you're using in some other program. And I've got it all the way down to simplify right to here. And you'll need to simplify a little bit more by taking the square root of 4, and then you'll be done with this one. Unless you can simplify by dividing everything by 2. So we're going to do one where we have to start at the beginning. Let's do there's only 4 of them you have to do. You have to do number 1, you have to just finish it, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5, you have to do these completely on your own. Let's look at number 3. Number 3, we have 2x squared minus 16x plus 27, and I've got the quadratic formula right up here. So I can see that while I do it. Now, here's another hint, is that you may very well want to complete this on a piece of notebook paper or print this out and do it on this. There's no reason to print the whole worksheet, but they're hard to type. If you want to use Microsoft Word and use the equation editor, you can. That's one way to do it, but you can also do it on a piece of paper and just submit a photo. If you don't know how to do that, you can contact me and let me know. So I'm going to do number 3. In number 3, first we need to figure out what is A, what is B, what is C. A is 2, that's the number in front of the x squared. B is negative 16, and C is 27. I should have checked first that this was in standard form, x squared, x, and then the constant, and that it was equal to 0, and that part was there. All right, now I'm ready to use the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula says that x is equal to negative b. That means the opposite of what my b term was. So it'll be the opposite of negative 16. So that'll be a positive, but I'll do that in the next step. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, that's a negative 16 squared, minus 4 times a is 2, and c is 27. These are going to be some big numbers. All divided by 2 times a, and a is 2. So your first step is to replace all of the variables with what they are equal to that you got from the problem. All right, next step. Negative 16. That's a positive 16. And now I'm going to start simplifying inside of the square root sign. So I have negative 16 squared. If you type negative 16 squared onto your calculator without using parentheses, it will tell you that this is a negative. Well, sometimes it will. But it's not. It's a positive because I'm going to use parentheses. Usually you should put parentheses in here. And now I have so many negatives. Negative 16 times a negative 16 is positive. Parentheses 16 negative. Parentheses. See, it still has a 0 minus. I still have something going on in this problem. Yeah, it's positive 256. Okay, so 256 minus, now I have to take 4 times 2 times 27. $216. And it's minus because it was minus all 3 of these multiplied. And divided by 4. Okay? Next step. I'm going to take 256 minus 216. And you can do it on a calculator if you want, but that will be 40. Okay, so far we have negative 16 plus or minus the square root of 40 all divided by 4. Now we're going to simplify the square root of 40. I'm going to do that off to the side. Square root of 40, square root of 40. I could do 4 times 10, 2 times 20, 8 times 5. If I do 4 times 10, the 4 is a perfect square. And in the last worksheet, we looked at how to simplify square roots, and that's how we would do that. So that would be the square root of 4 times the square root of 10. But we know the square root of 4 is 2, really plus or minus 2. And we'll write that down when we write 16 plus or minus. So this is equal to 16 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 10, all divided by 4. So we're almost done. Our last step is to simplify that fraction. That's really a fraction. It looks like a big, long, complicated fraction, but that's okay. If I were to factor out a 2 from each of these terms, or divide them each by term, 2, I'd have 16 divided by 2 is 8, plus or minus 2 times the square root of 10 divided by 2 would just be the square root of 10, and 4 divided by 2 is 2. So this then is the most simplified answer. kind of covered up the 8. Try that again. There. 8 plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2 is the most simplified way you would write that. When you simplify number 1 a little bit more, that's kind of what you'll do on that last step. You'll be able to divide everything by 2, and you'll end up with no fraction on that one. Sometimes when you simplify these, you'll get a perfect square, and you'll be able to get 2 answers. For example, if you end up with something like this, 8 plus or minus the square root of 16, then you would do 8 plus 4 is equal to 12, because the square root of 16 is 4. So that would be 8 plus or minus 4. And 8 minus 4 would be 4. So sometimes you'll get 2 integer answers when you're done. If you can simplify, simplify and get your answers. Okay, so there's only a few of those. Just practice. Do the best you can. Next, you're going to solve these problems. You just have to pick 4 of them to solve using any of the methods that you want. For example, some of these can be solved by factoring. Quite a few of them can be solved by factoring. Some of them can be solved by taking the square root. Remember that if there is no x term, like number 10 and number 12, then you can solve by taking the square root. Number 13 could be solved, I think, let's set this equal to 0. I think this is going to be a perfect square trinomial. Subtract 9 from both sides. And we have, it's in the form ax squared plus a times bx minus b squared. I forgot to write this like this. So if this is the way this is set up, then you can rewrite this as a, I don't know, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. A minus, no, that's not going to work, because how are we going to get a negative 9 here? So this is not a perfect square trinomial. So this one, if you choose to do this one, you'll have to do the quadratic formula. So you might not want to pick that one. That one cannot be factored because it's minus 9 here instead of plus 9. Most of these, though, can be either factored or you can use the square root method. I'm just going to set up number 10 but not solve it all the way. If I were to add 16 to both sides, I would get x squared equals 16, and then you can take the square root of both sides. And then you can find your 2 answers. These will have 2 answers. Many of them can be solved by factoring. So you'll set those up by x and x, and then find the factors of negative 18, that when you add them, you would get a positive 7. So think about that and what your factors might be. And then once you get your factors, then remember that you will set that equal to 0. So like if you got x, if one of these was x plus 9, you would subtract 9, and you get x equals negative 9 for an answer. So you've done this already, but just to practice. You can also solve by graphing, but don't do more than one of these by graphing. And if you do by graphing, then please attach your graph. Graphing is also a good way to check, so you could check any of those by graphing. All right, I'm not sure why my worksheet's going away. It's telling me my time is done. So do your best and have a great day.